Hello Year 10, I've put together this little video. So this slide just gives you an overview of the different questions on this exam. So it's paper 1, AQA, and the whole paper when you do it will be 2 hours long, but the first hour you will answer the questions from the Germany part of the course. And then this part of the course, conflict and tension, you would have an hour to answer these 4 questions. So there's just a little bit of advice there, which you can pause this video now and just have a read of that. But crucially, it tells you how long to spend on each question. So broadly, you want to try and spend the amount of time on the question according to number of marks. So you times number of marks by about 1.5, and then that tells you roughly how long to spend on each question. So for example, if it's worth 4 marks, 6 minutes, 12 marks, 18 minutes, 8 marks, 12 minutes, and the 16 mark question, about 24 minutes. So that's how you answer those questions. So for question number 1, you need to be able to analyse a cartoon in this case, but it will always be some kind of source, sometimes a picture source, a cartoon, sometimes a written source. So the question says, study source A. Source A opposes the policy of appeasement. How do you know? Explain your answer by using source A and your contextual knowledge. So contextual knowledge means what do you already know about what helps you to understand this source. So it's pretty crucial that this was written in 1936. So if you have a look at this cartoon, how do you know that it opposes the policy of appeasement? Well, appeasement was when the Allied countries like Britain and France kind of gave Hitler what he wanted in the 1930s, or didn't stop him from his aggressive foreign policy. And there's lots of reasons why they did that. You know, many of them very, very legitimate and for very, very good reasons indeed. But how do you know that this cartoon actually opposes that policy of appeasement? So there's a few clues in this source for you to actually look at. Firstly, it calls the leaders of democracy the spineless leaders of democracy, which suggests that they were quite weak. And then the fact that Hitler, as you can see here, being portrayed here, is sort of walking across them, suggests that he's kind of like walking all over them. He's pulling a face here, which suggests that he's got no respect for them. And also the words that are on their backs here talks about the rearmament of Germany here, the remilitarization of the Rhineland, and the taking over of Danzig as well. And then at the end, it talks about boss of the universe. So suggests that if Hitler's not stopped, then this is the eventual progression for Hitler. So in terms of relevant points from the cartoon, the word spans the democracy and what Hitler looks like. If you have a look on the faces of these people as well, they all look quite weak and kind of like scared. And then the contextual knowledge, you could make a direct reference to the fact that Hitler was able to reoccupy the Rhineland in March 1936 and a little bit of historical context around that. So this would be an example answer. So you can just pause this and read it, and that can just help you to think about the type of answer that you need for this question. So the key for this one, write about the content of the source, what it suggests, and then link it to your own knowledge, your contextual knowledge as well. So question number 2 requires you to look at how useful 2 historical sources are. Now, when you're thinking about how useful a source is, you need to think about how much evidence it gives you, and also whether that evidence might be reliable or not. Now, just because a source is reliable doesn't necessarily mean that it is really useful, and just because a source is biased doesn't mean it's not useful. So you just need to be aware of this, but it is obviously something for you to think about. Now there's 2 things to look at when you are answering a question like this one. The first thing you need to think about is what is the content of the source. So what does it actually tell you? And what information does it give you to finding out about, in this case, the weaknesses of the League of Nations in the 1930s. So how does what's in here help you to understand what the weaknesses of the League of Nations were in the 1930s? You then also need to think about the provenance of the source. So provenance means where does the source come from? So it's this bit here at the top, which I sometimes call the blurb. So who wrote it, when it was written, and maybe why it's written as well. So does the fact that it's written by a cartoonist called David Lowe make it more or less useful? The fact that he's a British cartoonist, does that make it more or less useful? So the first thing you have to be able to do is understand the source, and this is where you bring in your contextual knowledge as well, because you'll need your contextual knowledge to actually understand this source and what it means. So let's have a look at a few features of this David Lowe cartoon and what it actually means. So this figure here represents Japan. And you can see here Japan dressed up in military uniform. You can't see it very clearly here, but this actually says Japan is walking into a building which we can assume is the League of Nations because it says Geneva here, which we know is the headquarters of the League. This person represents a League of Nations official bowing down to Japan with some flowers in their hand, suggesting that the League is just basically not standing up to Japan at all and just letting Japan do what they like. This figure here is actually a reference to the British Foreign Secretary at the time, who was called John Simon, and he's applying something which says here face-saving paint to the League of Nations, so suggesting that countries like Britain were trying to suggest that they were dealing with the Manchurian crisis well, which of course they weren't. And this figure here is a metaphor for the League of Nations. And the fact that it's being walked over by Japan is obviously a metaphor for the fact that the League is weak in the face of Japanese aggression. Now, the context of this is that Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931. The League reacted fairly weakly to this. They set up a commission called the Lytton Commission to look into it, and Japan ended up storming out of the League of Nations. And obviously one of the key events in the 1930s which showed the weaknesses of the League. So the second source is a speech from Anthony Eden, who was the British Foreign Secretary at the time. And the context of this source is about the sanctions that have been given to Italy. Now, sanctions means punishments over their invasion of Abyssinia. Now, it's interesting to see here that Anthony Eden focuses on the incomplete membership and sort of is using this as an excuse to say why the British didn't deal and the League of Nations didn't deal with Italy during this time. But what the speech does not mention is the fact that Britain and France could have closed what was called the Suez Canal at the time to put more pressure on Italy, and the fact that the British were very concerned about not upsetting Mussolini during this time and were actually pursuing probably their own interests over the interests of the League of Nations. So there's a little bit of explanation there for you to have a look at. So you can just pause that and read that in your own time. So if you want to have a little look at an example answer, we'll have a look at one in a minute. One of the resources that I think is useful to help you when you're doing these questions is to look at this. It's called an extentometer. And there are some key phrases here that you can use when you're thinking about how useful the actual sources are. So we'll have a look at some example answers. This is one for source B, and you would have, when you answer this whole question, you need to spend half the time on source B and half the time on source C. So you can see here we're writing about some of the content of the source, and you can have a look at that. We reference to own knowledge as well, and then we're talking about the provenance. And just because David Lowe is possibly biased, and because it's a cartoon he is naturally exaggerating things, it is still a useful source for finding out about the weaknesses of the League of Nations, I would say. So pause that and have a look at that as an example answer. And then this is an example answer for source C. So again, if you want to read that, pause that and just have a read of that to see what a good response looks like. So probably within this answer, saying that source B is more useful than source C would be my own personal opinion, but it's up to you to say what you think. So moving on, let's have a look at question 3. Write an account of how the Nazis achieved the Anschluss with Austria in the 1930s. For this question, you need to focus on what happened, why it was important, and what the consequences were. So it's quite good to think about your answers having what I would call a beginning, a middle, and an end. And it's useful to use linking phrases such as this led to, as a result of, the impact of this was, that. These are useful phrases. And if you want to write about the importance of the event, this was important because, this was significant because. So this would be an example answer coming up. I just put these individuals on there because it can get quite confusing in this question about who the main individuals are in terms of the Austrian chancellors at the time. So this just has them for you in chronological order and helps you visualize what they look like. So this would be an example answer. So again, pause that and have a look at it. But just think about this in terms of a beginning, a middle, and an end. And you can see here some of these linking phrases that we can use to just really focus on the consequences. So using a phrase like here, as a consequence, on the 12th of March 1938, German troops invaded Austria. So that's what an answer to question 3 would look like. So you would have 12 minutes for that question. Finally, question 4, you get given a statement, an interpretation. In this case, the policy of appeasement was a mistake that led to the outbreak of the Second World War. How far do you agree with this statement? Explain your answer. You need to find evidence that appeasement was a mistake, so evidence which agrees with the opinion. Evidence that disagrees, so maybe that it's not a mistake, and then your overall opinion. Now, all the way through, you need to think about what is your point. So your point might be appeasement is a mistake or appeasement is not a mistake. What's your evidence for this? So you need some actual historical evidence. You need some facts, some events, some individuals to write about, some dates. And then the crucial thing is that analysis. So why does this evidence show that appeasement was a mistake? Why does this evidence show that appeasement was not a mistake? And really, analysis is where you show your own thinking. So it's about where you thought about the evidence and how you can actually use that evidence to support an opinion. So that's what we mean by point evidence analysis. Now, just to exemplify this, these are some of the key bits of evidence that you could maybe use within your work to help you. There's lots of other things that we looked at within the lesson online about appeasement being a mistake and not a mistake, so you can have a think about those things as well. This would be an example paragraph. So there is much evidence to suggest appeasement was a mistake. That's your point. For example, when Hitler reoccupied the Rhineland in 1936, the German army was still weak. So that's your evidence. Some historians argue that it would have been relatively easy for French and British troops to stop Hitler and send a strong message. Every time Hitler got away with breaking the Treaty of Versailles, it made him stronger and more confident. After this, he went on to fight in the Spanish Civil War and take over Austria through the Anschluss in March 1938. That part is your analysis bit, and that's where you're going to pick up your marks really for this question. You want to try and get a conclusion, so I've just written an example conclusion here. Really important that you express a strong opinion about what you think. So this is the conclusion I went for. It's not necessarily the right answer, it's just an example you can include. So overall, it's too easy to say that appeasement was a mistake because we now know that war did break out. At the time, it was a reasonable policy to try and do everything possible to avoid war. Politicians such as Chamberlain could not have known fully what Hitler's plans were, and it is unlikely the British people would have supported a war earlier than 1939. Therefore, I think that although appeasement did not prevent a war in the 1930s, it was worth trying, and that ultimately it was Hitler's actions that were to blame for World War II, suggesting appeasement was a reasonable policy to avert a war. So really my central point here is that just because appeasement failed and that there was a war in the 1930s and 1939 doesn't mean that the policy itself was a mistake. Had we gone to war in 1936 over, say, the reoccupation of the Rhineland, many people might have thought that this was an unnecessary war, and the British people themselves may well have not supported that conflict. You've got to remember at the time that everyone was desperate to avoid any kind of repeat of a war breaking out. So thank you very much for listening. I hope that's given you a little bit of feedback for that test. If you still got any questions, do let me know. But thank you very much for your time. I'm out.